Alright guys, so strap yourselves in for a long one because this is going to be very enlightening and it's going to tell us the roadmap to Armageddon in 2025 and going forward. And we have to look forward to the next evolution of the economic war. Now we said 2023 was going to be messy, 2024 was worse, and next year, the fireworks are about to explode. And whether you're an investor or you're a prepper, these four economic events are seismic. Now, most of them they are baked into the cake, and others they are coin flip. Now, some shocks could collapse the dollar, others are big threats to the US debt market, but all of them they point to bigger trade wars and greater animosity between the global superpowers. And let's start with BRICS. Now, at the start of the year, the bloc would formally accept six new members, and as we all know, Argentina dropped out, and Saudi Arabia they are still sitting on the fence. But even with four new members, especially Iran and the UAE, the expansion adds significant clout to the group. They account for 35% of global GDP at purchasing power parity, 45% of the global population, nearly 30% of global oil production, and over 20% of global exports in manufactured goods. Now, this throws a big wrench into the G7 plan and all their machinations. The idea, of course, is to control the global south with the established financial system. You use your dollar sanctions and weaponize SWIFT to ensure compliance. But if the majority of GDP, manufacturing, energy, and demand they all belong to BRICS, well, there's no competition here. And that's why it was a masterstroke to incorporate partner countries into the bloc. Now, during the summit in Kazan, Russia added 13 countries as partners, and China has confirmed 9 new additions and focus on Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Now, these are Southeast Asian countries that are growing fast with big consumer markets. They also have an enormous industrial capacity that works in favor of BRICS, especially for Chinese manufacturing. Now, it's a fact that Trump wants to bring home US manufacturing, and to do that, he has to tariff the world. Janet Yellen herself confirmed this back in April that the new US economy will be rejecting Chinese imports to protect their industries, or at least what's left of it. Since 2002, US manufacturing has been in decline. The biggest increase has been in food and beverage establishments, so yes, there are more cafes now. But is that really an achievement? Every other industrial sector has shrunk, from metals and paper to machinery and electronics. Thousands of companies have collapsed. A quarter of electronic manufacturing has vanished in the last 20 years. Trump wants to reverse that, but in order to bring back US production to reshore companies, he will have to damage America's biggest trading partners. And this means even allies like Canada, the UK, Germany, and Japan, they will have to deindustrialize. It's a zero-sum game. The demand for goods in the world is finite. So 3.2 trillion of imports are now at risk. Every single country on the left will be affected. The US wants to reduce the trade deficit, which is around $1.1 trillion. Imposing tariffs of 10% or more would do that. But there are always blowback effects to such desperate measures. The world could always counter tariff the US to reduce Trump's own exports. And if trade with the US drops, where else can the world turn to? They have no choice but to rely on consumer markets in the BRICS. So the biggest winner of the US trade war will be the global south. They have growing markets and a huge consumer class in waiting. Now, over the next 5 years, BRICS will contribute at least 40% of world economic growth. The G7's contribution will be dismal at just half that amount, which kind of makes sense. While the US economy remains somewhat robust, the rest of Europe is getting drained away to benefit the empire. It's important we also talk about China's growth because that in itself is their retaliation strategy. Beijing's response to the US isn't to mobilize their army, it isn't to scramble their fleet. This is economic warfare, and China is going to build up their own consumer base. In 2025, China is going to raise their budget deficit to 4% of GDP. It was 3% this year, but Beijing, they're going to ramp it up. This means an additional $180 billion in spending will flood the Chinese economy, which they can most definitely do without causing an inflation panic. Price increases are near 0%. The story gets even crazier next year. Beijing plans to issue a record 3 trillion yuan in special treasury bonds, and that's equivalent to $411 billion. That's almost on par with the 2008 Wall Street bailouts. And the money will be used to fund consumer subsidies, investments, and support the large state banks to allow them to loan more money to flood the economy with more liquidity. The ministry, of course, has vowed greater spending in 2025. Domestic demand across the board, they have to go up. Trump's tariffs threatens to collapse all direct Chinese imports into the US. The effective tariff rate on Chinese goods is around 11%, and that's 4 to 5 times more than other countries exporting into the US. Despite the tariff, China still exported $400 billion worth to the US. But what if the tariff gets hiked to 25%? What if it hits 60%? And that would collapse Chinese exports to the US. Even if the goods gets routed all the way through Mexico, margins would most definitely take a beating. And this is the threat facing Chinese companies in 2025. Tariffs will hurt US consumers for sure, but if you raise them high enough, it will hit Chinese exporters as well. The EU tariffs on Chinese EVs are a very good example of this. While companies like BYD, they're still selling cars, aggregate demand in the EU is starting to fall. Market share has dropped from 8.2% in October to 7.4% in November last month. The EU tariff rate is quite brutal. It's almost 45% for some brands coming into the common market. So in 2025, we can definitely expect big stimulus to flood the Chinese economy. And what they're doing now is not enough, and the time for half measures is over. The big takeaway is simple. China's decoupling with the G7 is going to accelerate next year. They can no longer rely on just exports to fuel growth. Just like the real estate model, China has to turn to a consumerist economy. The old models, well, they're all getting broken down. So 2025 is going to be wild. We have trade wars and global escalations. Things are looking very uncertain. But with chaos comes the opportunity to grow your wealth. Investing your money today is important. With cash losing value from inflation, buying assets is critical to protect and build your wealth. And that's why I want to talk about our sponsor today, Moomoo. This is my online broker of choice, allowing me to buy stocks from around the world, from the US to Hong Kong, using just one account. Moomoo is the number one downloaded Singapore trading app and provides zero commissions on US and SG stocks and ETFs. I've been trading with Moomoo and I love the ease of use and commission-free trading in the US market. And this allows me to save on expensive fees and buy more stocks that I love. One of my favorite features is the investment teams. I can easily find stocks on Moomoo that are related to specific events like the US rate cut, or identify stocks that could benefit from Trump's policies. Or are you looking to invest in gold? You can explore gold mining companies or related ETFs as well. The world is at your fingertips. Extreme convenience in one single app. And it gets better, guys. Moomoo has exciting welcome rewards waiting for you. You'll be able to get a stock bundle worth up to $2,266, and this includes one share of Tesla as well. Use my link in the description box and get an additional $20 when you sign up. So don't wait. Give Moomoo a try and start investing today. Now let's talk about Russia and Ukraine for a bit because this will be a big flashpoint in 2025. Now Trump wants to end the war, that much is clear. He has also hinted multiple times the US wants to exit the European theatre of war, at least to stop draining American treasure and prevent nuclear Armageddon.
A global conflict between nuclear-armed powers would mean death and destruction on a scale unmatched in human history. It would be nuclear Armageddon. Nothing is more important than avoiding that nightmare. Every day this proxy battle in Ukraine continues, we risk global war. We must be absolutely clear that our objective is to immediately have a total cessation of hostilities. All shooting has to stop. This is the central issue. We need peace without delay.
Now, I have to applaud Trump for this. The last thing anyone wants is mushroom clouds on the horizon. I don't want to play Fallout in real life, guys. I don't have a nuclear bunker to run to. But a sudden stop to the conflict won't be easy. The devil is in the details, and it has to be a mutually agreed settlement, which means Russia also has a say in how the war should end. And like it or not, this is the reality on the ground. Now, just a day ago, the Russians rejected Trump's call for Ukraine truce. Now, make no mistake, the Kremlin wants talks, but just not totally on Trump's terms. This is a very important distinction. The next segment from Lavrov is really important. It tells us Russia wants something concrete. After Istanbul and all the Minsk agreements, once bitten, twice shy. A ceasefire is a road to nowhere. We need conclusive, legally binding agreements which will create all the conditions for ensuring the security of the Russian Federation. Putin wants agreements that will be enforced not just by Russia, but by NATO, especially the Americans as well. A ceasefire is kind of pointless if a bigger conflict erupts just a few months later. But let's get real here. In addition to territorial gains, Russia is going to ask for their frozen assets back. And this will likely be a huge negotiating chip on the table, and it's a lot of money on the line. But will the EU play ball? The majority of Russian funds are frozen in Europe. Kaja Kallas, who's the EU head of foreign affairs, wants even more confiscation to use the money to aid Ukraine. And let's not forget the US has also given 20 billion to Kiev with the money backed by the seized assets. Will Trump U-turn this decision? Can he return the money? Because this could most definitely look like a point of weakness. And here's why this is important, especially if you're a gold investor. If the US or the EU doesn't give back the money, let's just assume that, they will be flashing the biggest Batman signal to the world. Global central banks, they will hear this loud and clear. Western bonds are no longer 100% safe. There's counterparty risk and your assets could always get confiscated. So the G7, they have crossed the Rubicon. So this is no longer unthinkable. It's now a strategy in a coming economic war. So if the assets aren't returned, it would be seismic. It would be bad news for the West, bad news for Russia, but kind of good news for gold. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the biggest threat facing the US in 2025 and beyond. And that is China disrupting the treasury markets. Firstly, let's realize the US bond market is in trouble. The data isn't looking good and investors, they're calling it out. The yields on the 10-year have risen to their highest level since May 2024. Yields have gone from 3.6% to 4.6%, which is alarming. This is during the same period when the Federal Reserve has been cutting rates on the short end. Fed funds is well below 4.3% and the yield curve has normalized. In other words, investors are demanding a higher return to hold US paper. They don't believe inflation in the US will ever reach 2%. It could even rebound with a vengeance. And as Trump plans to reshore industry, the amount of borrowing in 2025 is going to be literally insane. We are not even counting in other adventures Trump wants to have to confront China in the Panama Canal, to take over Greenland, and to troll Canada every single week. Yes, that was his Christmas message. It's really entertaining for sure, but it sounds very costly for the US. He's going to blow up the deficit here. Now, here are the figures and why bondholders are going to lose on a real basis. In 2024, the federal government ran a deficit of $1.8 trillion, and that's 8% more than the previous year. And this is just during Biden's term. Sure, he launched the CHIPS Act, he came out with the Inflation Reduction Act, which I don't think actually reduced inflation, and he gave Ukraine tens of billions. But Trump's trade war could cause even more, especially when revenue from the tax cuts, they're going to go down. And how are you going to make up for this shortfall? You run up the deficit once again. And here's how bad it could get, and this is a conservative estimate from the CBO. By 2034, the deficit will increase by another trillion, hitting $2.8 trillion. And this translates to 6.9% of GDP. But look at where the majority of the deficit comes from. It's from the net interest outlays. Just the interest payments alone are 4.1% of GDP. This is insane. So if you're China, this presents a point of vulnerability. Now there's a movie called Courage Under Fire. For Trump's economy is going to be reshoring under fire. Beijing is already starting to put pressure on US borrowing costs by issuing their own dollar bonds. using their trade surplus as an economic stick to clobber treasuries. Now, China just issued their own dollar bonds in Saudi Arabia a few weeks ago, and this was oversubscribed by over 20 times. They issued $2 billion in notes and received 40 billion in bids, and this allowed China to borrow at almost the same rate as the Biden government. This is insane, and it projects a very dangerous future for US borrowing costs going forward. And in some cases, China's dollar bonds have lower yields than treasuries. Beijing is getting local investors to store their money in Chinese dollar bonds issued by the government. And that's how crazy things are getting. And going forward, we can expect the Chinese to grab more capital away from the US. Now, this doesn't mean the US Treasury market is going to collapse tomorrow, but it does push forward the eventual day of default, day X. And the only way the US has left to counter China is to devalue the currency, weaken the dollar. However, that would mean a bigger inflation crisis in the short term. Can Trump really handle that? So realize 2025 is going to be messy. And if this trajectory continues, we can expect a few things. Higher asset prices, Europe getting much poorer, and China getting even more economic influence. And all of this are ultimately very destabilizing for the US. But as always, let me know what you think. Will 2025 get better with Trump in office? Or will it be worse than 2024? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.